I don't always fly fish for trout and other species of fish, but when I do, I most often use one specific presentation, and we're going to talk about that on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, Chad LaChance here. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. Of course, brought to us once again by the fine folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. You can visit them at sportsmans.com. They will ship directly to the store closest to you, and there's more than 140 of them nationwide. Also, for you Northern Colorado thinkers, don't forget about the folks at Peterson Toyota for all your Toyota stuff, used, new, or otherwise. Those guys love to fish. They're boaters, great outdoorsmen, and long-time supporters of the outdoors in our region. So give them a thought next time you're in the car market. Guys, I want to start this off real quickly by saying our thoughts are out for all the people with Hurricane Helene in Northwest Florida, or West Florida as the case might be. I have lots of roots to that area, lots of friends in that region. I spend a couple weeks a year there typically or more. I know the area fairly well, from Apalachicola, let's say, all the way down and around to the Tampa and farther south all the way to Naples. They took a whack last night. Heard a couple of folks that were a little bit callous saying if you can't stand the hurricane, don't live there, and that's really not the right attitude, to be honest with you. It's a beautiful region. It's also very resilient, and there's lots of tough people, and I say this with pride when I say I'm a Florida cracker at heart. So our thoughts were out with those guys, and hopefully they'll get healed up pretty quick, cleaned up from this mess, and move on. So any rate, having said that, it's a beautiful Friday afternoon here in Colorado, and I'm getting ready to go do some fishing, and was out in the shop working on grabbing some tackle, and I realized that I did the same thing I do almost all the time. I was getting ready to go fly fishing, and I looked at all the fly boxes, and there's about 30 of them in the garage, 25 of them. I only grabbed the streamer boxes. And the reason I decided I want to do a quick podcast on this is because all other things being equal, if I fly fish, I almost always streamer fish. And it doesn't seem to really matter if I'm fishing for trout or bass or walleyes or whatever. If I'm fly fishing, it almost always includes a streamer fly. And that might even be for things like cutthroats and brookies, where I'll throw real small streamer flies. Some folks might even get old school and call them wet flies. But at the end of the day, the small, or large for that matter, fly that is subsurface, that is actively moved or retrieved as opposed to drifted, is really the crux of what I kind of wanted to talk a bunch about, because I also believe that it is very often the best way to catch fish when other ways don't, or the best way to catch fish on fly tackle when other ways don't. When say dry flies aren't producing, or nymphs might produce and might not, the streamer fly will very often produce if you play with your presentations a little bit and get it done. So let me give you some quick background on that, mostly because I'm primarily known as a conventional tackle angler. And that's for a reason. I've been a fishing guide for 20 years. I've been hosting a TV show for 16 years. And there's just more of you that don't fly fish. There's more of you that conventional fish than fly fish by a significant margin. And even in my home state of Colorado. And that's important because if you're going to make a living doing something, I need to be able to appeal to the fat part of the bell curve, so to speak. And if I was only a fly fisherman, it would not have, or even if I focused mostly on fly fishing, it would not have been in the same kind of career as my background of conventional. The other thing is, I'm a big believer in artificial lures, period. I don't care if it's made out of plastic or rubber or fur or carved balsa wood or whatever. It doesn't matter to me. As long as it's an artificial lure, I'm happy presenting it. And that's nothing against bait. If you're a bait guy, knock yourself out. I have zero problem with that. And I will occasionally, maybe once every year or 2 years, throw some kind of bait for something or some specialized situation. But the overwhelming majority of the time, like 99.5% of the time, I'm going to throw a pure artificial bait of some sort. And I don't care if it's presented with the weight of the lure, as in conventional tackle, or the weight of the line, as in fly tackle. That's not, to me, a giant big difference one way or the other as far as the point of pride goes. And I fly fish whenever it's the right tool for the job. When it's not the right tool for the job, say mud, muddy water, heavy wind, big giant flows, anything like that, then I'm going to grab a conventional rod and be perfectly happy. Having said that, I already mentioned it's a beautiful afternoon in Colorado. I was fixing to walk down and go do some fishing, and the fly rod's when I picked up because there's not a puff of wind. It's nice and calm, a perfect scenario for throwing a fly rod. So that's some quick background there. Why do I always gravitate to moving flies that move? And as a disciple of old school fly fishing, and I took up fly fishing as a young kid, as soon as I moved to Colorado from Florida. By the time I was, say, 13 years old, I was fly fishing, and I fly fished a lot all the way until now, just not as much in front of the media, so to speak, or the camera. The reason I always end up going back to moving flies, it seems like, is because I spend so much time with conventional tackle, and I know that more often than not, it's how I move that lure that matters more than the lure itself. And so as a case study, let's say a jerkbait. Most days, if I've got a jerkbait bite going at all, I can make that jerkbait bite work with a half dozen different jerkbaits. Could be different colors, different sizes, different depth ranges even, so long as I work that jerkbait the same way. And somebody's going to say, well, they don't all behave exactly the same. And you're right, and that's my point. But their fundamental action is imparted 100% by the angler. So if whatever my speed and cadence and magnitude of my jerks and pauses and combination thereof is, as long as I duplicate that, I keep catching fish. It's not about the specific bait. Same thing with crankbaits. A lot of times, if I find out I can get bit on a high-speed wind, well, I can get bit on a high-speed wind with a half dozen different crankbaits as well. It's rarely about the specific bait and more about the action that I'm putting on that bait or how that particular bait is moving. And after you get that drilled into your head a whole lot of times, you start thinking about that and as it applies to other versions of your angling, i.e. the fly rod. And my big hang up with traditional fly fishing, and I'm not knocking it, again, not same as with bait, I care not how you fish. But if you want to catch more fish or you want to at least be open-minded and think about catching more fish, the reason I get hung up on original old school fly fishing was all about the dead drift. The fly shouldn't move. It needs to drift along, not move, and look as natural as possible. And like a bug in the surface film, it drifts along at the same speed as the current, and that's how we trick our fish into biting it. That's all fine and dandy, but that would be a one-trick pony. If you're really good at a dead drift, good for you, and you're going to catch a lot of fish, but that's not the only way to go about it. And I can dead drift a fly. Don't get me wrong. I can dead drift a fly. I've done a lot of it. I've done the whole Euro nymphing, Czech nymphing thing. I've done the whole, the bobber, just the more American style of bobbers and nymphs. And yeah, it's a bobber, not a strike indicator. I've done the really old school, which is still one of my favorites, of nymphing with no indicator and really going old school. And I love doing that. And that's a fantastic way to really hone in on what's going on. And I really love to drift a dry fly. But when those things, particularly the dry flies, not panning out, I'm not a huge nympher. I'm not a big giant. And if it involves a bobber, I don't want to do it anymore. I've done a lot of it. I understand it. I know it's 100% effective. I'm not doing it because I enjoy fly casting, and I don't enjoy fly casting with a bobber. So I would rather have no strike indicator and fish the nymph in most cases, although I'll be the first to admit you won't catch near as many fish. Or I'll just take that nymph off and put a streamer on and catch those same fish. And there's going to be a bunch of fly guys that are going to hear this. Hopefully, I appreciate it if you do. And you're going to say, nope, that's crazy. That's crazy. And I've had significant discussions with fly fishing guides even about that. And they aren't as sold on the fly motion as I am. And I've had long talks with Kelly Gallup. Kelly Gallup's pretty famous for his streamer fishing. He and I did presentations together years ago. at the International Sportsman's Expo, where he was taking spin fishing retrieves and applying them to his fly fishing. Well, that's basically the whole nutshell right there. When I had those discussions with him over that couple year period, my fly fishing morphed into mimicking my spin fishing a lot. And again, I love the fly cast. I love the feel of fighting a fish on a fly rod. And so if I can make it more effective, I'm going to do it. And basically what I figured out is even on the surface, if your fly moves, you might actually catch more fish than otherwise in a fair number of scenarios, and particularly if you go subsurface. And then I can use things like speed or erraticness or territorialness to get those fish to bite, as opposed to strictly hoping that the hatch occurs and the fish will feed and I have the right bug to match. The other thing about having a streamer bite or a wet fly bite, which is probably for me, I consider them the same because of the retrieves. Some purists may say streamers and wet flies are different, but for me, if it's subsurface and it's retrieved, it's a streamer for all intents and purposes, no matter how big or small it is. The crux of it for me became the fact that the more I moved the fly, the more fish I caught. And that even became a little bit on the surface. When I get fish that are refusing a dry fly, one of the ways to get them to bite it is to pull it away from him. Right when it starts to come into their view and you can see that they're going to get it, it's going to come right over them, they're going to look at it and they're either going to refuse it or get it. Well, maybe you skitter that fly just a little bit. And somebody's going to say, yeah, that's what I do during a caddis hatch. Fine, but I do it a lot, and it doesn't have to be during a caddis hatch, and you're going to catch fish doing that as well. And no different than I fish topwater lures on spinning rods, and I make them move across the surface of the water. So really, I should make this podcast really all about moving flies rather than streamer flies, because really it's all about the motion. But let's settle into the subsurface that I really started to do this, the streamers that I really go for. A couple key things about my streamer flies that are critical to my fly fishing with streamers and wet flies. One, as a general rule, I want them heavier than most people want them. And the reason is I want that fly to sink quickly. I'm not a big fan of a fly that sinks very slowly, or most other things that sink very slowly for that matter. The slower something sinks, the more time fish have to look at it, for one. And in the case of fly fishing, in moving water, if it takes a long time to sink and the fish are 2 or 3 feet down, then I need some time for that fly to get into their feeding range or their window where they're going to see it, and that means I'm going to lose part of my drift. So I want a fly that's going to go down relatively quickly. The smart guys out there are going to say, well, you're going to end up on the bottom really quick if your fly sinks too fast. And I'm going to counter that by saying, no, I'm not, because I'm going to strip it immediately and get some motion on that fly. And when you strip, that fly is going to come up in the water column. Now, when you pause it, it's going to go back down. And then when I strip it, it's going to come back up. Well, if that sounds suspiciously like jigging, you are correct. And so I tend to use that scenario of a heavy fly and a strip and pause a lot, because again, it jigs. And I've done whole podcasts saying that if I had one lure on conventional tackle for trout, there's without question, it's not even in the ballpark, it would be a jig. It would be some sort of a finesse jig. Well, I guess it doesn't come as a big shocker. Then I'm going to go that same route with a fly rod, where I'm going to take a streamer fly that's heavily weighted and I'm going to work it similar to a jig for the same reasons. The other thing about a heavy streamer that will be good is if I'm just swinging it, and that's really one of my favorites, and I really love doing that from a drift boat, where you throw a fly up against a bank or across the current, whatever the case might be, but it's across or maybe slightly up current, and then as the current comes down, it catches the line and gives a little bit of a belly or controlled belly in the line, and then it will accelerate your fly quickly. And if your fly is very light, it's going to come to the surface in a hurry. And so if you don't want that, then you need a heavier fly. And that's again why I gravitate to heavier streamers. So in the modern era of tungsten beaded streamers, it's not hard to get a streamer that's fairly heavy. And
I've got a bunch of streamers that I tied back in high school that aren't heavy enough. I've evolved a lot. I want to point out I'm in my 50s, and I tied these flies in high school, and I still have them, and I still will fish a bunch of them because I tied a lot of flies in high school. And yes, I was a nerd in high school. But at any rate, those flies weren't weighted nearly as heavy. So these days, I still want to use them, so I put a tiny split shot like an inch in front of the fly, maybe 2 inches in front of the fly, and it's really close. And the reason is that tiny split shot then looks like that little streamer's chasing it. And also it gives me the best control of that streamer, almost more along the lines of a jig. So if you've got a box full of streamers and they're not weighted or not weighted very much, and you're listening to this podcast and you want to try it, I'm not suggesting you need to run to Sportsman's Warehouse and buy a whole box of new streamers that are very heavy. You can just go there and get some split shot, lead split shot, or metal tin, whatever you like, and put one right ahead of your streamer, and it will accomplish the same thing as far as getting your fly down. But the speed that a swing generates is almost as good at getting bites as the jig that the strip generates up and down. So those two retrieves alone will make a lot of what I do with a fly rod, will make up a lot of what I do with the fly rod, I should say. And then the other one that I very commonly do with a fly rod, and this again is more similar to spin fishing by most guys' standards, is rather than using my stripping hand to move the fly, I will clamp the line with my rod hand finger, and then I will use the rod to move the line. And I definitely do that a lot in still water, where I'll make a long throw. I will strip, and make sure it's nice and tight, lines nice and tight and straight between me and the fly. I'll get the fly rod tip right down to the surface of the water, within an inch of the surface of the water, and then I will use the rod to move the fly, and then use my stripping hand to strip back as the rod gets behind. In other words, it gets farther past me, so to speak. Then I'll just strip back to my fly and then go back to moving it with the rod. And when you move a fly with the rod, as instead of with your stripping hand, what you do is you end up with a much more crisp motion. Your fly is much crisper in the way that it moves. It darts more and stops more, because when you're stripping in a traditional strip method, you've got a bow in the line. Then you've got to take the flex out of the rod, and then the fly will move, and so it softens all that. But if you're using the rod, then taking the bow out of the line has already occurred as soon as you start pulling on it. Second of all, the rod will load a little bit in and of itself, and then as that rod tip unloads, it will move the fly, and the fly will move very crisply. And that's a key part of the whole thing, is I generally want sharp, crisp motion with my flies and lures, more than a real soft, subtle, billowy or flowy type motion. And that's the same with marabou jigs on a spinning rod. That's the same with almost anything I do, and it includes the fly rod. So another part of it, besides just the weight of the fly, is the profile of the fly itself. And it seems like there's a lot of streamers out there these days, and that guys really bulk them up. And they're big, bulky streamers. They move a ton of water, lots of marabou, lots of fur, and they hold and move a lot of water. And they do breathe beautiful in the water. They really do. So in a fast water scenario, they're moving around. They look beautiful under the water, but they don't move quickly and they don't sink quickly. So for me, I'm a big fan of more sparse streamers and old school streamers, or modern streamers that are trimmed down a whole bunch. I'll buy them and then trim them down a whole bunch. It's common for me to buy a woolly bugger. Let's say I'm at Sportsman's and I need a woolly. I don't have a couple of woolly buggers. I didn't pack well. Something's wrong. I need a woolly bugger. I go buy woolly buggers. First thing I'll do is trim the hackle off them. I don't want all that hackle on it. It's going to slow the fly down. I want that beadhead, conehead woolly bugger without all that hackle. I'll take half of it off. So it's got maybe 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch of hackle on it instead of 1/2 inch of hackle on it, and leave the marabou. And now my fly will behave a whole bunch faster. I'm Clouser Minnow, my favorite, number one of all time. If I'm picking one fly for everything, it's a Clouser Minnow. I've had talks with Bob Clouser about this. There's 2 of them hanging in my office here that he tied for me, that Bob Clouser tied for me and hand-signed cards that he stuck them on. They're Clouser Minnows. It's my favorite fly of all time. And if you really think about a Clouser Minnow, it's a jig. And for the record, he tied that fly to catch smallmouth bass in Pennsylvania, not for trout fishing. It's just that it's very universal. And if you really think about it, it's really a jig. When I have those flies tied for me, I don't tie flies anymore. I don't have time. People ask me, "Why do you tie your own flies?" No, I don't mold my own worms. I don't tie my own flies. I don't have time for these kinds of things. If I had that kind of time, I'd rather go fishing. So I don't tie my flies. I have a friend that ties some flies for me. I have him tie my clouser minnows out of pure synthetic material rather than the bucktail they would normally be tied out of, or calf's tail, or the other things they've been tied out of different stuff over the years. The reason being is those materials are buoyant, very buoyant, and they hold the fly up, which means I need more weight to get it to sink fast. So if you tie it out of synthetic material that holds water, well, now I can get the 95% of the same look, but I can throw it with less weight, which means it's more enjoyable to cast, and it attains the same sink rate. So I can move it faster. And one thing I'll tell you about trout, speed is the thing. I've done this on a lot of podcasts, almost redone it, but if you move it fast enough, you will get the attention of a lot of trout. That's all there is to it. And the slower the water, the faster that tends to work. And we've all had trout that grab something when you're reeling it up to cast it again, and that's a prime example of that. You're just reeling it up real quick, not even looking, and all of a sudden, boom, it gets chased down by a trout. You realize he's right at your feet. Maybe he got it, maybe he didn't, but he chased it down. And that speed is your friend in that regard. And that's what I'm talking about with the streamers. And there's been a lot of scenarios where I beat the water to death with nymphs, couldn't get fish to bite. Was fishing with a well-known fly fishing guide here in Colorado. We'd fish for hours. We'd caught 1 or 2 fish drifting nymphs. Finally, camera guy got mad. He's tired. Camera guy gets bored, by the way. If he's filming and nobody's catching anything, it doesn't make for his job any fun either. He finally got mad, yelled at me, literally yelled at me to go to the dang car, get the streamer rod, and get back here and catch some fish. We had like a half an hour left to film in that day. We had caught 2 fish in like 3 hours. We caught like 8 in the last half hour in the middle of the afternoon by putting a small streamer on and making it go as fast as I could make it go and effectively crashing the hatch. Just getting these fish that were feeding on little tiny nymphs on the bottom to forget they'd ever seen a nymph, and grab a 2-inch long streamer running full speed with a bunch of weight on it and save the day. I've seen that scenario a lot. And for the record, I've seen that scenario even in the wintertime. We filmed a show in February, swinging streamers in Colorado, and we were miles below the dam. In other words, not in the area that's right in the tailwater, but we were downstream from it where it's still warm enough to keep from freezing, and we slayed them swinging streamers. And in that day, I was able to even instigate some fish that ran up on the streamer and didn't get it, and I just kept pulling it away from them, and as soon as they'd lose interest, I'd strip it hard away from them, and they'd turn around, and I got several of them to bite it that way on film. So it's not about the seasonal conditions. It's not about any of that. It's about the fact that speed, erraticness, an up and down jig motion, those things all get fish to bite. And if I can figure out how to do that with my fly rod, then so be it. I will catch more fish rather than just relying on a perfect dead drift all the time. I mentioned repeatedly at the beginning of this that I fish wet flies a lot. I like them for their small profile. One of my favorite ways to just run out, if I'm just going to go catch them. Let's say I'm just going to jump in the car, I'm going to go catch some trout just for fun. I got an hour to kill. I'm going to run to the river. It's not a big giant fishing trip. I'm going to take like a number 12, the old school partridge soft tackle, which is just a generic little soft tackle fly that literally I tied back in the 80s, and I'm going to put a little split shot ahead of it, and I'm going to let it chase that split shot. And that fly's weighted, but it's nowhere near weighted enough, and such a small thing that it won't get down that fast. But with the split shot right ahead of it, it will. And again, the split shot's like an inch, maybe 2 inches in front of the fly. Now it sinks good, and I can strip it fast, and it doesn't really seem to matter whether they're feeding on terrestrials or nymphs or anything else. If I do that, it's a small little thing running really fast, it's really natural colors, and it will get you some bites. And it's as close to just universal bite getter as you can get. When I walk down here to see if I can catch some of the trout that are rising behind my house, I'm not going to try to match what they're rising. I have no idea what they're rising to, but I guarantee you if I throw that little soft tackle and it starts to sink and I strip it back, particularly if I strip it fast, they're going to come get it, and that's what makes the thing so universal for me, and why I get so good at it, or that's not the right word. So addicted to it, I guess would be the better way to put it, because I just know with the right motion I can get those fish to bite, and there's obviously nuances to it on any given day. For me, one of the things is I throw floating fly lines. I'm not a fan of sinking fly lines. And again, it goes back to the fact that I like to cast a fly rod, and I don't like to cast a sinking fly line. I like to throw 90 footers with floating fly line, big long throws, just because, and that's what I almost always do in Stillwater, because I like the feel of having 75, 80 feet of line in the air and how it feels in a fly rod when it loads and unloads. It's not because I need to make a 90-foot throw. It's because I can and I like to, and it feels cool to do it. And I, oh, by the way, get a real long strip back to the boat or back to the bank, as the case might be. River, that's never productive or rarely productive because you lose control. But with the streamer, you don't have to have as much control because you're tight lining the fly. And if your fly is very sharp, your hook is very sharp, just the weight of the belly in the current in the line will go ahead and bury that thing enough that when you pull into them, you'll go ahead and get them. But the sheer speed of the whole thing, and the fact that you have more control because you're tight lining it, and even more so when you're moving the fly with the rod tip as opposed to with your stripping hand, you're really in good position to catch a lot of fish in that scenario, and that's why I do it. So again, this podcast is a little bit rambly, but if you take nothing away, a streamlined fly rather than a big giant bulky fly with plenty of weight and fished on a floating fly line where when you strip it, it will jig up and down, or if you swing it, it will stay down, and you swing it fast across the current, you're going to get a lot of bites. And I don't care if we're talking January, and I don't care if we're talking August or anywhere in between, you have a chance to get some bites. And if we're in a muddy water scenario, you can bulk the fly up a whole bunch, so they can find it. Where like I might throw a 5-inch long fly, like a saltwater fly or a bass fly, in heavy muddy water, because the fish can locate it. They need the calories. They want the calories. They can locate it in the muddy water, and I use the speed to make them not be afraid of it. So if I dead drift a 5-inch long fly, or even just slowly drift a 5-inch long fly in front of a 12-inch trout, he's going to get out of the way of it at best, and maybe he's going to spook. But if I rip it at full speed across the current in front of him, well, now all bets are off, and he may chase it down and grab it, which occurs more often than you'd think. So, and the muddy water gives it a big profile, something they can easily find. Same thing with heavy current. When the current's really ripping, trout are struggling. They need a big bite. It's more efficient calorically for them to get a big bite of food than it is to eat 10,000 little midges. Well, then give them a big bulked up fly, but if you're going to do that, it needs to run from them. So if it's got a big silhouette, it needs to run from them, and if it runs from them, then they will bite it. When the last scenario being, you can sometimes crowd them in a feeding lane. This generally works better with hard plugs because they swim in the current better, but a streamer fly that is fed straight downstream and they're just crowding a fish that is feeding on bugs or whatever. He's in a feeding lane, you can see him, and he's just sitting there feeding and doing his thing. Well, if you don't have the bug you need to match it and feed it to him, then take a great big streamer fly, put it in his face, and let it go back and forth in front of him and just crowd him. Their territorialness will kick in, they'll bite it, and I don't care why they bite it, but they bite it, and they're biting out of aggression, trying to get it to leave, but hey, fine with me. I got to catch fish either way. So again, heavy, streamlined flies, make them move. Don't be afraid to move them quick. Little tiny wet flies, again, make them move, get them going quick. You're going to get a lot of fish, and don't be afraid, even on the surface, to move your fly on the surface. And that is not just for caddis flies, and that is not just for terrestrial patterns. Any kind of dry fly with a little bit of skitter on it will get their attention. And I don't care what kind of bug it is, when it gets to the surface, it's going to move around a little bit. So even just shaking your fly rod tip and giving it a little bit of motion is better than nothing in a lot of scenarios. So I'm all about fly fishing. I love to do it, but I'm almost never about a perfect dead drift. That makes me odd. hopefully you guys will take some of that to heart. So if you want to join the conversation on social media, that's at Fishful Thinker, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and especially our YouTube channel. Please check that out at Fishful Thinker as well. We're putting a lot of stuff up there. Maybe you're listening to this podcast there, but we'd appreciate a like and a follow there at any chance you get. And also check us out on Altitude Sports and Entertainment. And real quick, the new streaming app for Altitude Sports. If you're a Nuggets and Avalanche fan, you want to be able to see us as well, you can get that new streaming app coming out pretty quick. And you'll be able to get it on there as another way to watch Fishful Thinkers. We appreciate you watching. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.